And as we follow this thread a little deeper, something remarkable begins to reveal itself, not as a belief, but as a pattern we can observe. I've spent years exploring the intersection between ancient symbols and modern biology, and one idea continues to surface with quiet persistence: the possibility that the language of life is not random. That within every human cell there may exist a kind of repeating message, one that ancient cultures seemed to recognize long before microscopes ever existed. When we look at DNA, we're taught to see it as a sequence of chemical codes: adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, 4 simple building blocks forming the blueprint of life. But what if we pause for a moment and shift our perspective? What if, instead of seeing only chemistry, we begin to see structure, rhythm, even meaning? Across 4 ancient languages separated by geography, time, and culture, there appears a fascinating convergence. Each of these systems assigns symbolic representations to the elements of life. And when those symbols are arranged in a particular way, something unexpected happens. They seem to point toward the same core idea, not a literal word in the modern sense, but a shared expression, one that echoes the essence of life itself. Now, I want to be very clear. This isn't about forcing science into mysticism or mysticism into science. It's about recognizing that both are attempts to describe the same reality from different angles. One through measurement, the other through meaning. Imagine for a moment that your body is not just a collection of cells, but a living library. Every strand of DNA is like a sentence, every gene a paragraph. And within this vast biological text, there may be recurring patterns, phrases that repeat, not by accident, but by design. What's fascinating is that ancient scholars, without access to modern tools, often described life using symbolic alphabets that mirror these patterns. They spoke in terms of vibration, geometry, and resonance. Today, we use different language, frequency, structure, information, but the underlying concepts are not so different. This brings us to a profound question. If the same symbolic word appears across multiple ancient systems and aligns with patterns in our own biology, what does that say about the nature of human consciousness? Because here's where it becomes personal. Our cells are not isolated units. They respond, they communicate, they adapt based on signals from their environment. And one of the most powerful environments they respond to is internal. Our thoughts, our beliefs, our emotional states, these are not abstract experiences. They are biochemical events. When we hold a belief consistently, the body begins to organize around it. Neural pathways strengthen, hormonal patterns stabilize, even gene expression can shift over time. This is not speculation, it's something we can measure. So if our internal state can influence our biology, and our biology carries patterns that may reflect deeper symbolic structures, then we are not separate from this language of life. We are participants in it. Think about that for a moment. Every emotion you feel, whether it's stress, calm, fear, or gratitude, sends signals into your cells. These signals don't just pass through, they leave an imprint. Over time, they shape how your body functions, how resilient it becomes, how it heals. And if there is indeed a repeating word embedded within our cellular structure, a kind of foundational pattern, then our emotional state may influence how clearly that pattern is expressed. It's almost as if the body is constantly asking a question: what environment am I adapting to? And our beliefs are part of that answer. Ancient traditions often emphasize coherence, alignment between thought, emotion, and action, not as a philosophical ideal, but as a practical necessity. When these elements are out of sync, the body experiences tension. When they align, there is a sense of flow. Modern research is beginning to echo this idea. Coherent emotional states, such as appreciation or compassion, have been shown to create measurable changes in heart rhythms, brain activity, and even cellular processes. The body becomes more efficient, more balanced. So what happens when we live in a state of chronic incoherence, when our thoughts say one thing, our emotions say another, and our actions reflect something else entirely? Over time, that misalignment can create noise in the system. Signals become distorted. The body struggles to maintain balance. And the deeper patterns, the ones that may carry this ancient word, become harder to recognize, harder to express. But here's the empowering part. Just as these patterns can become obscured, they can also be clarified. Through awareness, we begin to notice our internal state. Through intention, we can shift it. And through consistent practice, we can create a new baseline, one that supports coherence rather than conflict. This doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. Even a few moments of genuine calm, of focused breathing, of consciously choosing a more supportive belief. These small shifts begin to send new signals into the body. Over time, they accumulate. And as they do, something subtle begins to change. The body starts to respond differently. Stress responses become less reactive. Recovery becomes more efficient. There's a sense of stability that wasn't there before. It's not dramatic. It's not instant. But it is real. And if we return to the idea of a shared word within ourselves, something recognized across ancient languages and reflected in modern biology, then perhaps what we're really exploring is not just a code, but a relationship between awareness and matter, between belief and biology, between the stories we tell ourselves and the structures that sustain us. Because at the deepest level, our cells are listening. Not in the way we listen with ears, but in the way systems respond to input. Constantly adjusting, constantly interpreting, constantly becoming. So the question becomes, what are we telling them? Are we reinforcing patterns of fear, limitation, and disconnection? Or are we cultivating states of clarity, resilience, and alignment? This is where ancient insight and modern science begin to converge, not in opposition, but in collaboration. One offers language, the other offers measurement. Together, they point toward a possibility that is both simple and profound, that the word within us is not something we need to find, but something we are already expressing moment by moment, breath by breath, choice by choice. And as we begin to explore how this expression shapes not only our inner world, but also the reality we experience around us, we start to notice a subtle shift in how we interpret cause and effect within our lives. Because what begins to change first is not the outer world, it's our relationship to it. I've noticed that when we become aware of the signals we're sending from within, we stop reacting automatically and start responding intentionally. That subtle shift alone begins to reorganize our experience. Think of it this way: if the body is continuously reading the language of our inner state, then every reaction we have is also a kind of instruction, not just mentally, but biologically. When we feel overwhelmed and assume we have no control, the body receives that message as a cue for survival. Stress chemistry increases, muscles tighten, the system prepares for threat. But when we pause, even briefly, and introduce a different signal, something remarkable happens. The body doesn't argue, it listens, it adjusts. I've seen this in the simplest practices: slowing the breath, softening the focus of attention, bringing awareness into the present moment instead of projecting into imagined outcomes. These aren't just relaxation techniques, they are ways of communicating with the deepest layers of our biology. And over time, the message becomes clearer. The noise created by constant stress begins to fade, and in its place, a more coherent signal emerges. It's not something we hear as a sound, but something we feel as stability. A sense that the system is no longer scattered, but organized. This is where the idea of a shared pattern, this ancient word embedded in life, starts to feel less abstract and more experiential. Because coherence isn't just a concept, it's something we can feel in the body. When your thoughts, emotions, and physical state align, there's a noticeable shift. Breathing becomes easier. The mind feels less cluttered. There's a quiet clarity that replaces internal tension. And in that state, the body seems to function differently. Healing processes become more efficient. Energy is used more effectively. Even perception changes. We begin to notice opportunities where before we saw only obstacles. This raises an important question. Is it possible that the clarity of this internal language depends on the coherence of the system expressing it? In other words, the pattern may always be there, but how clearly it's expressed could depend on the state we're in. If that's true, then personal growth isn't about adding something new. It's about removing interference. It's about refining the signal. And that brings us to belief. Belief is often misunderstood as something purely mental, something we choose intellectually. But in reality, belief is embodied. It's reinforced through repetition, through experience, through emotion. A belief held long enough becomes familiar, and what is familiar feels safe to the body, even if it's limiting. So if someone carries a belief of inadequacy, for example, the body organizes around that expectation, not because it's true, but because it's consistent. The system learns to predict based on that pattern. Changing that belief, then, isn't just about thinking differently, it's about feeling differently, consistently enough that the body begins to trust a new pattern. This is where many people struggle. They try to change their thoughts, but their emotional state remains anchored in the past. The signal is mixed. The body receives conflicting instructions. But when thought and emotion align, when a new belief is not just imagined but felt, something shifts at a deeper level. The body begins to respond as if the new pattern is real. And over time, it becomes real in a very practical sense. Behavior changes, decisions shift, the way we interact with the world evolves. This is not instant transformation, it's a gradual reorganization, but it's powerful because it suggests that we are not fixed, that the language within us is dynamic, responsive, influenced by how we engage with our own inner world. And if we return again to the idea that ancient systems recognized a common pattern, a kind of universal expression reflected in life itself, then perhaps what they were pointing toward was not something external to discover, but something internal to align with. A baseline state of coherence, a way of being where the system operates with minimal distortion. In that state, intuition becomes clearer. Decisions feel less forced. There's a sense of being guided, not by something outside, but by a deeper intelligence within the system itself. This doesn't mean we stop facing challenges. It means we meet them differently. Instead of reacting from habit, we respond from awareness. Instead of reinforcing old patterns, we begin to create new ones. And over time, those new patterns become the default. This is where the practical application becomes very real. Every day offers countless moments where we can either reinforce incoherence or cultivate alignment. It might be in how we respond to stress, how we interpret a situation, or even how we speak to ourselves internally. Each of these moments is an opportunity to influence the signal, to bring more clarity into the system, to support the expression of whatever this deeper pattern truly is. And while we may not fully understand the origins of this word that seems to echo across cultures and biology, we can experience its effects through the quality of our own state. Because ultimately, this isn't about decoding an ancient mystery for the sake of knowledge alone. It's about recognizing that our inner environment is not separate from our physical reality, that the way we think and feel is continuously shaping the conditions within our own body, and that by becoming more intentional with that process, we begin to access a level of influence that most people overlook. Not control in the rigid sense, but participation. A conscious relationship with the systems that sustain us. And as we continue exploring how this relationship extends beyond the individual, how collective beliefs, shared emotions, and group coherence might influence larger systems, we begin to step into an even more intriguing territory where the boundaries between internal and external start to blur, and the implications of this ancient repeating pattern take on an entirely new dimension as we consider what happens when multiple human systems begin to synchronize around a shared internal state. Because up until now, we've been exploring this pattern as something personal, something happening within the boundaries of a single body. But the moment we widen the lens, a deeper implication starts to emerge. If each of us carries this language within ourselves, and if our internal coherence influences how clearly it is expressed, then what happens when many individuals begin to generate coherence at the same time? I've often reflected on this not as an abstract theory, but as a lived observation. When people come together with a shared emotional state, whether it's tension or calm, you can feel the difference immediately. The environment changes, not metaphorically, but tangibly. Conversations shift. Reactions soften or intensify. The collective field begins to take on a quality of its own. And this is where things become especially interesting, because the body doesn't exist in isolation. It is constantly exchanging information with its surroundings through subtle signals, electrical, chemical, even rhythmic. We are continuously interacting with the world around us. The heart generates measurable electromagnetic patterns. The brain emits frequencies. These are not speculative ideas. They are observable phenomena. So if each individual is contributing to a kind of shared field through their internal state, then coherence is not just personal, it's relational. Now imagine a group of people, each intentionally cultivating a state of clarity, stability, and emotional balance. Not perfection, but genuine alignment. What begins to happen is a kind of resonance. Individual signals start to reinforce one another. The noise diminishes. The shared field becomes more ordered. And in that environment, something subtle yet powerful begins to unfold. People report feeling more connected, more intuitive, more aware. Solutions arise more easily. Conflicts de-escalate with less effort. It's as if the system at a collective level becomes more intelligent. This invites a deeper question. Could the word we've been exploring, the pattern embedded within ourselves, also express itself at a collective scale, not as a literal sound or symbol, but as a quality of organization, a kind of coherence that emerges when enough individuals align internally? If that's the case, then the implications are profound, because it means that personal work, our efforts to refine our own beliefs, regulate our emotions, and cultivate awareness, is not just self-focused, it contributes to a larger system. Every moment of coherence adds to the field. Every moment of chronic stress or disconnection also adds to the field. And over time, these contributions shape the environments we live in, our relationships, our communities, even the broader social dynamics we participate in. This perspective changes how we think about responsibility. It's no longer just about what we do externally, but about the state we carry internally. Because that state is not contained, it radiates, it influences. And while that might sound abstract, we can see its effects in everyday life. Think about how one person's calm presence can shift an entire room, or how a single anxious voice can create tension that spreads quickly through a group. These are simple examples, but they point to a deeper principle. Internal states are contagious. Not in a mystical sense, but through very real mechanisms of human interaction, facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and even subtle physiological cues that we're only beginning to understand scientifically. So when we talk about coherence, we're not just talking about personal well-being, we're talking about the quality of the systems we are part of. And this brings us back to belief, but now at a collective level. Just as individuals carry beliefs that shape their biology, groups carry shared assumptions that shape their collective behavior. These beliefs influence what is considered possible, what is expected, what is reinforced. If a group operates from a baseline of fear or limitation, its patterns will reflect that. Decisions become reactive. Innovation slows. Trust diminishes. But when a group begins to operate from a more coherent state, where clarity, openness, and stability are present, the dynamics shift. New ideas emerge, collaboration becomes easier, there is a sense of movement rather than stagnation. This isn't about idealizing human behavior, it's about recognizing patterns. And if we take this one step further, we begin to see that the language of life we've been exploring may not just be encoded in our cells, but expressed through our interactions, through the way we listen, through the way we respond, through the way we choose to engage with uncertainty. Each of these becomes a form of communication, not just between people, but between systems. And in that sense, we are constantly participating in the expression of this deeper pattern. Sometimes clearly, sometimes with distortion, but always participating. So the question evolves once again. It's no longer just, what am I telling my body? It becomes, what am I contributing to the field we all share? Because the answer to that question doesn't just shape personal experience, it influences the trajectory of the environments we help create. And as we begin to explore how this shared field interacts with even larger systems, how collective coherence might influence not just social dynamics, but the way we perceive reality itself, we start to approach a threshold where the distinction between observer and participant becomes increasingly difficult to define, and where the ancient idea of a unifying pattern begins to feel less like a concept and more like something we are actively generating together, moment by moment, as we step further into the realization that we are not simply observing reality unfold, we are participating in how it takes shape. This is where the conversation begins to shift in a very subtle but important way. Up to this point, we've explored the idea that our internal state influences our biology, and that shared coherence can influence collective environments. But now we arrive at a deeper layer, the possibility that perception itself is part of the creative process. I've found that when we examine how we experience the world, we rarely question the mechanism behind it. We assume that what we see, hear, and feel is a direct reflection of what exists out there. But modern science suggests something more nuanced. The brain is not simply receiving reality, it is interpreting it, filtering it, organizing it based on prior patterns. In other words, what we perceive is shaped in part by what we expect, and expectation is closely tied to belief. So if belief influences perception, and perception influences how we respond, then belief becomes a kind of lens through which reality is experienced, not in a vague or philosophical sense, but in a very practical, neurological way. This is where things become both empowering and challenging, because it means that two people can encounter the same situation and experience it very differently, not because the situation changes, but because the internal filters are different. One sees limitation, the other sees possibility. One feels threatened, the other feels curious. And those initial interpretations set into motion entirely different biological and behavioral responses. Over time, those responses reinforce the original belief, creating a feedback loop. The body adapts to the expected environment. The mind gathers evidence to support the familiar narrative. And the cycle continues, often unnoticed. But when we become aware of this loop, we gain the ability to interrupt it, not by denying reality, but by recognizing that our interpretation of it is not fixed. This is where the idea of the language within takes on a new dimension. Because if our cells are continuously responding to the signals generated by our internal state, and if that state is influenced by how we interpret the world, then changing our interpretation becomes a powerful point of influence. It's not about forcing positivity or ignoring difficulty. It's about expanding the range of what we allow ourselves to perceive. For example, in a moment of uncertainty, the automatic response might be tension, anticipating a negative outcome. But with awareness, we can introduce a different perspective, not a guaranteed positive outcome, but an openness to multiple possibilities. That single shift begins to change the signal. The body moves from a narrow defensive state into a more flexible one. And in that flexibility, new responses become available. This is not abstract, it's something we can practice. Each time we notice a reaction, we have an opportunity. We can follow the Privitchny pattern, or we can pause and choose a slightly different interpretation. At first, the change is small, almost imperceptible. But over time, these small shifts accumulate. The feedback loop begins to reorganize. The body learns a new baseline, and the language being expressed within our system starts to carry a different tone, one of adaptability rather than rigidity. This brings us to another important insight. If perception is part of the creative process, then attention becomes one of our most valuable resources. Where we place our attention determines what information is amplified, and what is amplified influences how the system responds. If attention is constantly drawn to threat, the system organizes around defense. If attention is directed towards stability, possibility, or even simple presence, the system begins to organize differently. This doesn't mean ignoring challenges. It means not allowing them to dominate the entire field of awareness. Because whatever dominates attention tends to define experience. And over time, it shapes the patterns within us. So when we speak of a shared word embedded in life, a pattern recognized across ancient systems and reflected in modern biology, we might begin to understand it not as a fixed message, but as a dynamic expression, something that is always present, but continuously modulated by how we engage with our own awareness. In this sense, the word is not something we read, it's something we live. Moment by moment, through perception, through attention, through the meaning we assign to our experiences, and as we begin to refine these elements, belief, emotion, perception, attention, we start to notice a deeper coherence emerging. Not just in isolated moments, but as a more consistent state. There is less internal conflict. Less fragmentation, a greater sense of continuity between what we think, what we feel, and how we act. And in that continuity, something interesting happens. Decision-making becomes clearer, not because we have all the answers, but because the noise has been reduced. The signal stands out. This is often described as intuition, but it's not something mysterious. It's the natural result of a system that is no longer overwhelmed by competing inputs. A system that can process information efficiently because it is internally aligned. And when enough individuals begin to operate from this level of coherence, the collective effects we discussed earlier become even more pronounced. Communication improves, understanding deepens. The shared field becomes more stable. And in that stability, new possibilities begin to emerge, possibilities that may not have been accessible from a state of fragmentation. So we find ourselves at an interesting intersection. Ancient systems pointing to a unifying pattern, modern science revealing the responsiveness of biology to internal states, and personal experience confirming that shifts in awareness can lead to measurable changes in how we live. These are not separate domains. They are different perspectives on the same underlying process. A process in which we are both participants and observers, shaping and being shaped at the same time. And as we continue to explore what it truly means to engage with this process consciously, what it looks like to live in a way that consistently supports coherence, clarity, and alignment, we begin to approach a level of understanding where the distinction between inner and outer, between signal and expression, starts to dissolve, revealing a continuity that invites us to reconsider not just how we experience reality, but what role we may actually be playing in its unfolding as we move into the next layer of this exploration, where the boundaries of what we once assumed to be fixed begin to open into something far more fluid than we were ever taught to expect. Because once we begin to see reality not as a fixed structure, but as a responsive process, the way we engage with it naturally begins to change. I've noticed that the moment this understanding settles in, not just intellectually, but experientially, we stop trying to control every outcome and start working with the patterns that give rise to those outcomes. And this is where subtlety becomes essential. The changes we're talking about are not loud. They don't announce themselves dramatically. Instead, they emerge quietly through shifts in perception, through the refinement of attention, through the gradual stabilization of our internal state. At first, it may feel almost too simple to matter. A conscious breath, a deliberate pause before reacting, a choice to reinterpret a moment that would have once triggered a familiar pattern. But these small moments are not insignificant. They are the points at which the system begins to reorganize itself. Because every time we interrupt an automatic reaction, we create space. And in that space, something new can emerge. This is where personal agency becomes very real, not as a grand concept, but as a series of micro-choices that accumulate over time. Each choice sends a signal. Each signal contributes to the overall pattern, and gradually the pattern shifts. What's fascinating is that the body doesn't require perfection to begin this process. It responds to consistency. Even a slight increase in coherence, practiced regularly, begins to recalibrate the system. Stress responses become less dominant. Recovery becomes more accessible. There is a growing sense that we are no longer being pulled entirely by past conditioning, but are beginning to participate more actively in shaping our present experience. And as this participation deepens, another layer reveals itself. We begin to notice that time feels different. Moments that once felt rushed or fragmented start to feel more expansive. There is a greater sense of presence, not because time has slowed, but because attention has become more focused and less scattered. This shift in attention has profound implications, because when attention is stable, perception becomes clearer. And when perception is clearer, the decisions we make are more aligned with the actual conditions we're in, rather than the assumptions we've carried forward from the past. This is where many of the limitations we experience begin to loosen, not because the external world has changed, but because our interaction with it has become more accurate. We're no longer filtering everything through outdated patterns. We're seeing more of what is actually there. And that clarity allows for more effective action. Now, if we bring this back to the idea of a shared pattern, a kind of word embedded within life, it becomes easier to understand how this pattern might express itself more fully when the system is clear. Not because the pattern changes, but because the interference has been reduced. It's similar to tuning a signal. The broadcast is constant, but the quality of reception depends on the state of the receiver. When the system is noisy, the signal is distorted. When the system is coherent, the signal becomes clear. And in that clarity, there is a sense of alignment that feels both stable and dynamic at the same time. Stable in the sense that there is less internal conflict. Dynamic in the sense that we remain responsive, adaptable, open to new information. This balance is important because coherence is not rigidity. It's not about locking into a single state or belief. It's about maintaining enough internal organization that we can adapt without losing stability. And this adaptability is what allows growth to continue. Because as we move through different experiences, new information is constantly being introduced. New challenges, new opportunities, new perspectives. If the system is too rigid, it resists this information. If it is too chaotic, it becomes overwhelmed by it. But when there is coherence, the system can integrate new inputs effectively. It can learn. It can evolve. And this evolution is not something separate from the language we've been exploring. It is part of how that language is expressed, continuously updating, continuously adapting, while still maintaining an underlying pattern. This brings us to a subtle but important realization. The word within us is not static. It is not a fixed message etched permanently into our biology. It is a living expression, one that interacts with our environment, our beliefs, our perceptions, and our choices. And this interaction is what gives it depth, what allows it to carry meaning beyond structure. Because meaning is not just in the pattern itself, but in how the pattern is experienced, how it is lived, how it is expressed through the way we engage with the world. So as we continue this exploration, the focus naturally begins to shift again from understanding the pattern to embodying it, from observing coherence to practicing it, from recognizing the influence of belief to consciously refining the beliefs we choose to reinforce. And this is where the journey becomes deeply personal, because no one else can make these shifts for us. No one else can regulate our internal state, direct our attention, or reinterpret our experiences. These are processes that unfold within each of us. But at the same time, they are not isolated, because every shift we make contributes to the larger field we are part of. Every moment of clarity adds to the collective. Every moment of awareness strengthens the overall pattern. And over time, these individual contributions begin to accumulate in ways that are not always immediately visible, but are nonetheless significant. This is how larger changes begin. Not from a single dramatic event, but from many small, consistent shifts occurring across individuals and groups, each one refining the signal, each one reducing the noise, each one bringing the system into greater alignment. And as this alignment deepens, both individually and collectively, we begin to approach a threshold, a point at which the accumulated coherence reaches a level where entirely new patterns of interaction become possible, where the boundaries of what we once considered fixed begin to reorganize, and where the question is no longer whether change is possible, but how far this process of conscious participation can actually extend as we continue moving into a space where our understanding of influence begins to expand beyond what we once believed was possible. Because at this stage, something subtle but powerful is taking place. We're no longer just observing the relationship between thought, emotion, and biology. We're beginning to recognize that this relationship is scalable. That the same principles shaping our internal state may also be shaping the systems we move through every day. I've noticed that when people truly begin to embody coherence, not just practice it occasionally, but live from it consistently, their impact becomes quieter, yet more profound. They don't need to force outcomes. They don't need to push against resistance in the same way. Instead, their presence begins to organize interactions around them. Conversations become clearer. Decisions become more grounded. Even complex situations seem to resolve with less friction. And this isn't because external challenges disappear. It's because the way those challenges are met has fundamentally changed. At this level, influence is no longer about control, it's about alignment. Alignment between intention and action, between perception and response, between the internal state and the external behavior that emerges from it. When these elements are aligned, there is a kind of efficiency that begins to appear. Energy is no longer wasted on internal conflict. Attention is no longer scattered across competing narratives. Everything starts to move in the same direction. And in that movement, something else becomes noticeable. Feedback becomes clearer. The results of our choices are easier to interpret because they are not being filtered through layers of contradiction. We begin to see more directly how our internal state is interacting with the world around us. This creates a powerful learning loop. We adjust, we observe, we refine, and with each cycle, our ability to engage consciously becomes more precise. Now, if we connect this back to the idea of a shared pattern, a language embedded within life, it suggests that this process of refinement is not just personal development, it's a kind of tuning. We are, in a sense, tuning ourselves to resonate more clearly with a pattern that is already present. Not imposing something new, but revealing something that has always been there beneath the noise. And as that resonance becomes more stable, our experience of reality begins to shift in ways that are both subtle and significant. We start to notice connections that were previously overlooked. Patterns that once seemed random begin to make more sense. There is a growing sense of continuity between events, as if they are part of a larger process rather than isolated occurrences. This doesn't require any extraordinary assumptions. It simply reflects a change in perception, a shift from fragmentation to coherence. And with that shift comes a different way of engaging with uncertainty. Instead of seeing uncertainty as something to resist, we begin to see it as space. Space where new patterns can emerge, where possibilities have not yet been fixed into form. This changes how we respond. We become less reactive, more curious, more willing to stay present with the unfolding process rather than rushing to impose a conclusion. And in that presence, we often find that solutions arise more naturally, not because we've forced them, but because we've allowed enough clarity for them to become visible. This is where the idea of participation becomes even more meaningful, because we are not just influencing outcomes through action, we are influencing the conditions from which those outcomes emerge, through the quality of our attention, through the coherence of our internal state, through the beliefs we consistently reinforce. All of these factors contribute to the environment in which decisions are made and possibilities are realized. And when enough of these factors align, there is a sense of flow that begins to replace effort. Not the absence of effort, but a different quality of it. Effort that is directed, efficient, and responsive, rather than strained or forced. This is often where people begin to describe a feeling of being in sync with their environment. Again, not in a mystical sense, but in a very practical one. Their internal processes are no longer working against the conditions they're in. They are working with them. And this alignment creates momentum. Small actions lead to meaningful results. Feedback loops reinforce progress rather than resistance. The system becomes self-supporting. Now, it's important to recognize that this state is not permanent. There will always be moments of disruption, unexpected challenges, situations that pull us out of coherence. But the difference now is awareness. We notice the shift more quickly. We recognize the signals, and we have the tools to return to alignment more efficiently. This ability to recalibrate is just as important as maintaining coherence itself, because it allows the process to remain dynamic, flexible, resilient, and over time, this resilience becomes one of the most valuable outcomes. Not because it eliminates difficulty, but because it changes our relationship to it. Challenges become part of the process rather than obstacles to it. They provide information. They highlight areas where alignment can be refined. They contribute to growth rather than interrupt it. And as this perspective stabilizes, we begin to see that the language we've been exploring, the pattern expressed within ourselves and reflected in our experience, is not separate from the challenges we face. It is present within them, guiding adaptation, shaping response, supporting the continuous evolution of the system. So the journey we've been following from the cellular level to the collective, from belief to perception, from awareness to participation, begins to converge into a single ongoing process, a process in which we are continuously interacting with the patterns that shape our lives. Not as passive observers, but as active participants. And as we continue to explore how far this participation can extend, how deeply we can refine our internal state, how clearly we can align our actions, how consistently we can engage with awareness, we begin to approach a horizon that invites an entirely new question, one that moves beyond understanding into direct experience, asking not just what this pattern is or how it functions, but what becomes possible when we learn to live in such a way that every thought, every emotion, and every action begins to reflect a level of coherence so consistent that it transforms not only how we experience reality, but how reality itself appears to respond as we move into the final layer of this exploration, where the distinction between expression and creation starts to dissolve into.
When we step back and gently reflect on everything we've explored, a deeper understanding begins to unfold, one that is less about theory and more about direct experience. Let me guide you through this in a simple way. At the heart of the idea is this: your body is not just a physical structure. It is a responsive system, constantly listening, adapting, and reorganizing based on the signals it receives. And one of the most powerful sources of those signals is not the outside world, but your inner world. Think of your body like a garden. If you plant seeds of stress, fear, and constant worry, and you water them every day with your attention, what grows? The system becomes tense, reactive, and defensive. Not because it wants to, but because it is adapting to what it believes is the environment. Now imagine planting different seeds. Moments of calm, feelings of appreciation, a sense of trust in the process of life. At first, nothing dramatic happens. Just like a garden, change takes time. But if you consistently nurture these states, something begins to shift. The soil, your internal environment changes. And once the soil changes, everything that grows within it begins to change as well. This is the essence of the mind-body connection. Your thoughts are not just in your head. They trigger real chemical responses. Your emotions are not just feelings. They are signals that influence how your cells behave. Over time, repeated thoughts and emotions become patterns, and those patterns shape your biology. Now, here's where it becomes even more interesting. We often think that we react to life as it happens, but in reality, much of what we experience is filtered through our beliefs. Beliefs act like lenses. They shape how we interpret situations. For example, imagine two people facing the same challenge, perhaps a job loss. One person sees it as a failure, a confirmation of their fears. Their body responds with stress, tension, and a sense of shutdown. The other sees it as a transition, an opportunity to explore something new. Their body responds differently, still uncertain, but more open, more adaptable. Same event, completely different internal experience. And over time, those internal experiences lead to very different outcomes. This is why belief matters so deeply. But here's the key insight. Beliefs are not fixed. They are learned patterns, and anything learned can be relearned. Now, I want to be honest with you, changing belief is not about simply thinking positive. That rarely works on its own. The body does not respond to words alone. It responds to consistency between thought and feeling. So if you say, I am calm, but your body is filled with anxiety, the signal is mixed. The system doesn't know which message to follow. But if you take a moment, slow your breathing, soften your body, and genuinely begin to feel even a small sense of calm, now the message becomes clearer, and this is where practice comes in. Let's make this practical. Start with something simple, your breath. When you feel overwhelmed, pause for just 1 minute. Slowly inhale through your nose. Gently exhale through your mouth. Do this without forcing anything. What you are doing is not just relaxing. You are sending a signal to your body. It's safe to shift. Over time, this small practice begins to retrain your system. Next, bring awareness to your thoughts. Not to judge them, but to notice patterns. Ask yourself, is this thought helping me or is it reinforcing stress? You don't need to fight the thought. Just recognizing it creates space. And in that space, you gain choice. Another powerful practice is emotional alignment. Choose one emotion you want to cultivate. Gratitude is a good place to start. But don't just think about it. Feel it. Think of a real moment. Something simple like a quiet morning, a kind interaction, or even just the comfort of breathing. Let that feeling grow even slightly. This is how you begin to shift your internal state from the inside out. Now, you might be wondering, does this really make a difference? The answer is yes, but not in the way many people expect. This is not about instant transformation. It's about gradual reorganization. Think of it like tuning a musical instrument. At first, the sound may be slightly off, but with small adjustments, over time it becomes clear, harmonious, and stable. Your body works the same way. Each moment of awareness, each intentional breath, each shift in perception is a small adjustment. And those adjustments add up. Over time, you may begin to notice subtle changes. You react less quickly. You recover from stress more easily. You feel more present, more grounded. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to feel a sense of participation in your own life. Not just reacting, but shaping your experience. Now let's connect this to something deeper. If every person is constantly influencing their internal state, and those states affect how we interact with others, then this process doesn't stop with you. It extends outward. Your calm can influence another person's stress. Your clarity can bring stability into a chaotic situation. You may have experienced this before, being around someone who feels grounded and noticing that you begin to feel more at ease without knowing why. This is the ripple effect of coherence. So when you work on your inner state, you are not only changing your own experience, you are contributing to the environment around you. This is where personal growth becomes something much larger. Not something isolated, but something interconnected. And as you continue practicing, something shifts in your awareness. You begin to realize that life is not happening to you, it is happening with you. Your thoughts, your emotions, your attention, they are all part of an ongoing interaction between you and the world. And the more conscious that interaction becomes, the more intentional your life begins to feel. So I'll leave you with something to reflect on. You don't need to change everything at once. You don't need to be perfect. Just begin with one small shift, one conscious breath, one moment of awareness, one choice to respond differently. Because within those small moments, something much bigger is quietly taking shape. And as you continue, day by day, you may begin to notice that what once felt automatic is now something you can gently guide. And that subtle shift is where the real transformation begins to unfold.